You did everything right, and still nothing changed. It's not lack of faith. It's not lack of effort. It's the mechanism nobody showed you. There's a strange thing that happens with intelligent people when they discover that the mind can influence reality. They immediately start using it with more force, more concentration, more clarity in the images, more repetition, as if the problem were intensity and the solution were more of the same, just amplified. And the harder they try, the more reality seems to resist. Not by accident. There's a specific mechanism operating here. And it works in a way that's completely opposite to what most people have been taught to believe. I'm going to dismantle that mechanism now. Not as theory, as observation of something that can be verified directly, in your own mind as you read. Let's start with something apparently simple. What are you actually doing when you visualize? The obvious answer is, I'm imagining something I want. I'm creating a mental image of the desired future. I'm programming my mind to attract or build that reality. That's the surface answer. But observe more deeply. What's really happening? When you visualize something you desire, there's a silent presupposition embedded in that act. A presupposition that most people never notice because it's hidden in the structure of desire itself. The presupposition is this: what I'm visualizing is not yet real. It seems obvious. It seems harmless. But that's exactly the presupposition that creates the problem. Because the mind doesn't process intention. The mind processes state, not what you want, what you are. And the moment you visualize something with the emotional weight of, I don't have this yet, the mind registers the underlying state, not the content of the image. It registers the absence, the gap, the distance between where you are and where you want to be. Visualization, without the correct state preceding it, doesn't create closeness to the desired outcome. Confirms the distance. Kalani was 34 years old and had been practicing manifestation techniques for 2 years with a discipline few people can sustain. She woke up at 5 in the morning. She wrote her goals. She visualized in details she herself described as cinematic. Textures, sounds, physical sensations. She felt the emotion of already having achieved it. She was good at this. Technically very good. On a Tuesday afternoon, while writing in her notebook, the pen slipped and rolled across the table. Kalani watched it stop at the edge, still without falling. And she simply stopped. It wasn't a decision. It was a kind of soft collapse. Like when you suddenly realize you've been holding your breath for a long time without knowing it. She put the notebook down. She stared at the ceiling. She thought about nothing. 3 minutes, maybe 4. When she came back, she didn't return to the technique. She didn't yet know what had happened, but something had reorganized internally. A pressure she didn't even know existed had disappeared. In the weeks that followed, 3 situations moved without her having done anything different externally. It wasn't magic. It was coherence. But she only understood the mechanism months later. What Kalani touched in those 3 minutes has a name. It's the 0 point of identity, the neutral field, what I'm calling here the null state. Before continuing, I need you to understand a fundamental distinction, because without it, the rest of what I'm about to say will sound like just another variation of what you've already heard. The distinction is between mental content and mental state. Content is what you think. The images, the words, the plans, the visualizations, the affirmations, everything that happens inside the mind and can be described, narrated, explained. State is what you are while you think. It's the base condition, the configuration of the system while content passes through it. Most manifestation techniques work exclusively at the level of content. Change what you think. Change the images. Change the words. Change the internal narrative. And there's value in that, but it's partial value. Because content is processed by state. And if the state is in a mode of scarcity, of effort, of identity tension, every piece of content introduced into that state will be filtered, distorted, and eventually neutralized by it. It's like trying to plant in contaminated soil. You can use the best seeds, the most advanced planting technique, the best available fertilizer. But if the soil is poisoned, the plant won't grow. The state is the soil, and visualization is the seed. The number one mistake isn't visualizing in the wrong way. It's visualizing before preparing the soil. Now I'm going to need you to follow a line of reasoning that will seem counterintuitive, and that may need a second reading to fully settle. The mind that desires is always in tension, not because desire is wrong, but because desire implies difference. It implies recognition that something is not present. And that recognition, when loaded with emotional weight, creates a specific identity pattern, the being who doesn't yet have. That pattern is self-sustaining, confirms itself continuously, because every action you take from within it is filtered by it, and tends to reproduce the conditions that generated it. You try harder. The force confirms the effort. The effort confirms the struggle. The struggle confirms that this is difficult. And difficulty reinforces the original pattern. This isn't pessimism. It's mechanics. What interrupts this cycle isn't a more powerful technique. It's the temporary collapse of the pattern. And that's exactly what the null state produces. Before going further, let me be precise about what I'm calling the null state, because it's easy to confuse with relaxation, meditation, or giving up. It's none of the three. The null state is a point of identity suspension. Identity here isn't self-esteem or sense of worth. It's something more technical. It's the set of patterns of perception, response, and interpretation that constitute the self in continuous operation. You have an identity that wakes up in the morning with certain thoughts, that reacts in predictable ways to certain stimuli, that perceives the world through specific filters that were calibrated by accumulated experience. That identity is useful. It's necessary for the functional navigation of life. But it's also limiting because it can only produce what it already knows how to produce. It can only perceive what it's already calibrated to perceive. It can only create within the limits it has already established as possible. The null state is the moment when that identity stops. Not permanently, not destructively, but for long enough for the system to reconfigure, for new patterns of perception to emerge, for the mind to operate, even if briefly, from a different base condition. It's like restarting an operating system. When the computer restarts, it doesn't lose its functions, but it clears the background processes that were consuming memory. It recalibrates and operates more efficiently afterward. The mind works in an analogous way. The null state is the restart, and the visualization that comes after it occurs in a recalibrated system, without the background noise of the identity intention. But here appears the paradox that confuses most people. How do you enter the null state intentionally? The answer is you can't. At least not in the way the word intentional normally suggests. Because intention is a function of identity. And the null state is exactly the suspension of that identity. So any deliberate attempt to reach the null state from an identity in effort will reproduce the original problem. It will be just another layer of effort on top of effort. People who try to enter the null state by force arrive at forced relaxation. a performative emptiness, at a kind of superficial silence with tension underneath. That's not it. The null state isn't reached. It's allowed. And the difference between reaching and allowing is the difference between everything, the entire mechanism I'm trying to dismantle here. Now let me introduce a concept I'll call identity pressure, because it's central to everything that comes after. Every operating identity maintains a constant pressure. That pressure is the implicit effort of pattern maintenance. It's the energy required to keep being who you are in the face of a world that doesn't necessarily confirm that all the time. When you identify as someone who hasn't yet achieved X, that identity exerts pressure to confirm itself. It perceives the world in a way that reinforces that narrative. It interprets neutral events as confirmation of the absence of X. It creates tension in the direction of X, but a tension that, paradoxically, maintains the distance. When you identify as someone who is trying to manifest X, the pressure increases. Because now there's an additional layer, not just the absence of X, but the active effort toward X with all the emotional weight that implies. And the harder you try, the more the identity pressure solidifies. The null state dissolves that pressure. Not because you give up on what you want, but because you temporarily suspend the identity that is wanting, and with it, the tension that identity maintains. What remains after that dissolution isn't emptiness. It's neutral field. And neutral field has a property that identity intention doesn't have. It's genuinely open to new configurations. But here appears the paradox that most resists intellectual understanding. How do you enter the null state intentionally? The answer is you can't. At least not in the way the word intentional normally suggests. Because intention is a function of identity. And the null state is exactly the suspension of that identity. So any deliberate attempt to reach the null state from an identity in effort will reproduce the original problem. It will be just another layer of effort on top of effort. People who try to enter the null state by force arrive at forced relaxation, a performative emptiness, at a kind of superficial silence with tension underneath. That's not it. The null state isn't reached. It's allowed. And the difference between reaching and allowing is the entire mechanism I'm trying to dismantle here. There's research worth mentioning here, not as definitive proof, but as a reference point for a phenomenon that can be verified experimentally. Studies on the flow state, that peak performance state where performance is maximum and effort seems minimal, consistently show that it's not achieved by more effort, but by a kind of relaxation of the conscious identity. Elite athletes describe the flow state as not being there. Musicians describe the music playing itself. Writers describe the words coming from somewhere beyond me. This isn't mysticism. It's phenomenological observation of a specific cognitive state. What these people describe is the temporary suspension of the controlling identity, and the emergence of a mode of operation that, paradoxically, produces results far superior to the controlled mode of operation. The null state is the version applied to the intentional creation of that same phenomenon. It's not about producing peak performance in a specific activity. It's about creating the internal conditions for reality to respond coherently, without the noise of the identity intention interfering with the signal. Now I need to add another layer. Because up to here I've been describing the problem and the general mechanism. But the title of this video is specific. The mistake of visualizing before entering the null state. And that mistake is deeper than it appears. When you visualize in the wrong state, in the state of identity tension, in the state of effort, in the state of I don't have this yet and I want it badly, you're not simply being inefficient. You're actively training the pattern you want to overcome. Because the mind learns through repetition of states, not of contents. You can visualize your dream house every day. But if every visualization is done in the state of someone who doesn't have the house, you're repeating and solidifying the state of not having. The image of the house is just the content. The state of not having is the pattern being trained. That's why many people who practice manifestation techniques for years seem to get more stuck, not less. Because they're consistently practicing the wrong state. They're getting very good at wanting, and wanting implies lack. The problem isn't the practice. It's the order. The correct order inverts what most people do. Most people do clarity about the desire, then visualization, then an attempt to create the correct emotional state during the visualization. The order I'm proposing is null state first, then visualization from that point, then action that emerges naturally from that state. The difference seems small. It's fundamental, because visualization done from the null state doesn't carry the weight of the identity intention. It's not the effort of someone trying to create a different reality to escape something. It's the exploration of a field of possibility by a mind that isn't emotionally invested in the difference between what is and what could be. This completely changes the signal the mind sends to itself, to the cognitive structures that process perception and response, to the system as a whole. Let me be even more concrete about the mechanism. The mind intention perceives selectively. It filters reality according to the dominant pattern. If the dominant pattern is effort toward X with fear of not making it, the mind will consistently perceive the data that confirms that pattern, the obstacles, the distances, the failures, the evidence that X is far away. This isn't pessimism. It's simply how the attention system works. It prioritizes what is coherent with the dominant state. The mind in the null state perceives differently, not because the world changed, but because the filter changed. The attention system is no longer organized around a specific tension pattern. And then, things that were always available, connections, opportunities, information, people, begin to appear in the field of perception. Not because they didn't exist before, but because before they were filtered as irrelevant by a system organized around a different pattern. Kalani didn't create the three situations that moved. She simply stopped filtering the possibilities that were already present. The null state doesn't create reality from scratch. It reorganizes perception, and different perception produces different response, and different response produces different trajectory. There's a version of this mechanism that appears in completely different domains, and that helps understand why it's structural, not spiritual. In quantum physics, there's the concept of superposition. A quantum system exists in multiple states simultaneously until an observation collapses it into a specific state. I'm not going to make a simplistic analogy between quantum physics and the mind. That kind of analogy is almost always poorly done and creates more confusion than clarity. But there's an analogous structure that's useful here. The mind in identity tension is constantly observing, in the sense that it's constantly filtering and collapsing possibilities according to the dominant pattern. It's always taking the open possibilities of reality and collapsing them into the version that's coherent with who it believes it is. The mind in the null state, having temporarily suspended the dominant pattern, is less observing in the technical sense. It's more receptive, more open to the emergence of configurations that the dominant pattern would have filtered. It's not about quantum mechanics. It's about how cognitive filters work. And a suspended filter perceives more than an active filter. Now I want to talk about what happens when you don't enter the null state, and you visualize anyway. There's a specific effect I'll call the negative confirmation loop. It works like this. You visualize X from the state of, I don't have X. The visualization is processed by the current state, which registers the distance between the visualized present and future. That distance generates a subtle emotional tension. You try to compensate for the tension with more intensity in the visualization. More intensity increases the emotional investment. More emotional investment solidifies the identity of someone who wants very much and still doesn't have it. And that identity produces more tension, which demands more intensity in the next visualization. The cycle closes, and with each iteration, the pattern goes deeper. That's why many people who practice manifestation techniques with discipline and consistency describe a growing sense of frustration, almost of betrayal. I'm doing everything right. Why isn't it working? The answer is, because the discipline was being applied to the cycle, not to the mechanism that sustains the cycle. Hard work in the wrong place doesn't produce results. Produces elegant exhaustion. The null state interrupts the cycle. Not because it's a more powerful technique within the same system, but because it operates at a different level. It acts on the state that sustains the cycle, not on the content that circulates within it. And here is the point that most resists intellectual understanding. The null state isn't something you add to your practice. It's a condition you allow before the practice. It seems like a semantic distinction. It isn't. Adding implies the system keeps operating and you insert a new element. Allowing implies the system stops, and something different emerges in the space created by that stopping. Most techniques operate in addition mode. Add affirmations. Add visualizations. Add gratitude. Add morning rituals. Add more intentional clarity. The null state operates in subtraction mode. Subtract the identity pressure. Subtract the effort of pattern maintenance. Subtract the noise of constant wanting. And see what remains when all of that stops. What remains is the neutral field. The absence of identity in tension. And it's in that field that visualizations find real soil, not contaminated by the pattern they were trying to overcome. Now I want to explore an objection that will arise for many people. But if I stop wanting, don't I lose motivation? If I suspend the identity that's seeking X, don't I lose my sense of direction? It's a legitimate objection. And the answer reveals something important about how direction and desire work. Motivation based on identity tension isn't sustainable. It works for short periods of high intensity, and then collapses into burnout, abandonment, or a kind of emotional numbness where you keep going through the motions without feeling anything for them anymore. You know that experience. You've probably lived it. What emerges from the null state isn't lack of direction. It's direction without tension. It's clarity about what matters, without the emotional weight of, I need this to be complete. And there's a fundamental difference between wanting something because you're incomplete without it and wanting something because it genuinely expresses who you are. The first is tension. The second is coherence. And coherence produces sustainable action without the emotional and cognitive cost that tension demands. Now I'll introduce the concept of coherence as a trigger for change, because that's what the null state produces in practice. Coherence, here, isn't behavioral consistency. It's something more precise. It's the alignment between internal state and external expression. It's when what you are internally and what you do externally aren't in conflict, aren't pulling in opposite directions. Identity tension is, by definition, incoherent. You are internally someone who doesn't have X, and externally you're trying to produce the conditions for having X. Internal and external are in conflict. The system spends energy maintaining that conflict in operation. The null state dissolves the conflict because it temporarily dissolves the identity that created it. And when you emerge from the null state and begin to act, that action doesn't carry the weight of conflict. It's born from a place of less internal resistance. And reality responds differently to coherent action than to conflicted action. Not because the universe is evaluating your vibration or your emotional state, but because coherent action tends to be more precise, more sustainable, more connected with the real needs of the situation, and less distorted by the internal noise of an identity intention. There's a second error related to the main one that's worth naming explicitly. Many people, upon hearing about the null state or neutral field, try to use it as another manifestation technique. They think, I understand, so I enter the null state first, and then I visualize, and then I manifest. That's the correct mechanism described with the wrong logic. The wrong logic is treating the null state as a tool within the system of effort-based manifestation, as a step zero before the usual process. When you do that, you're using the null state instrumentally. And instrumental intention is a form of effort. And effort will prevent the null state from establishing itself genuinely, because the null state is exactly the absence of effort. What seems like a paradox has a practical exit. Entering the null state cannot be motivated by the desire to manifest better. It has to be motivated, if that word even applies, by genuine recognition that the system is in tension and needs to stop. Not, I'll enter the null state to manifest better. But, I perceive that I'm in tension. The system needs to stop. I'm allowing it to stop. The difference is subtle in description and radical in experience. Reverse reasoning. What if what you call failure in your manifestation attempts isn't a sign that you're doing something wrong, but a sign that the mechanism is trying to show you something you haven't yet seen? I'm not romanticizing failure. I'm not saying failure is a gift in disguise. I'm saying something more specific. The pattern of tries hard and it doesn't work is information about the state, not about the desire. It's the system telling you that the identity pressure is too high for any technique to work effectively. It's like trying to tune a musical instrument while it's being played. The sound that comes out during tuning tells you nothing about the music. It tells you the instrument is out of tune and needs recalibration. Repeated failure in effort-based manifestation is the sound of a detuned instrument asking for recalibration. The null state is the recalibration. Let me now be concrete about what the null state actually looks like in practice, because up to here I've been mostly conceptual, and concept without practical anchor stays suspended in the air. The null state isn't a state of absence of thought. Minds don't stop thinking, and any technique that promises to completely stop thought is, at best, producing suppression, not suspension. The null state is a state where thoughts continue, but identification with them reduces drastically. Normally, when you think, I don't have X and I really need X, there's total identification with that thought. It's not observed as a thought, it's lived as immediate reality. The tension it generates is felt as the tension of the situation, not as the tension of the thought. In the null state, the same thought may appear, but there's a space between the thought and the identification with it. You observe the thought as a mental event, not as the direct description of reality. That space is the null state, not absence of content, but absence of fusion with content. And in that space, identity pressure dissolves, not because the thoughts disappeared, but because the identity stopped fusing with them for a moment. There's a form that most people have already touched the null state without knowing that what they were touching had a name or a specific function. It's the moment of complete self-forgetfulness in an activity. Not the high-performance flow, but simple forgetfulness. You're doing something with your hands, or looking at something in nature, or listening to a specific sound with full attention. And for a few seconds, there's no you observing. There's only the act. In that instant, the identity intention paused. The problem is that this state occurs by accident, and it's quickly interrupted by habitual thought that returns and recaptures attention. What I'm describing isn't creating that state artificially, because artificiality is a form of effort. It's recognizing it when it appears. It's creating the conditions for it to appear more frequently. And it's learning to let visualization occur while it's still present, before the identity intention returns and recontaminates the process. This requires a specific kind of attention. Not the attention that focuses and concentrates, but the attention that observes and allows. The observation of the mind as a mechanism for entering the null state. Let me develop this further. Most contemplative traditions, regardless of any cultural or religious context, converge on one point. Observation of the mind produces a functional separation between the observer and the observed content. And that separation is what dissolves compulsory identification with thought patterns. I'm not talking about formal meditation. I'm not suggesting you need a specific practice. I'm talking about a capacity that any mind possesses and rarely exercises. The capacity to observe its own thought instead of being continuously swept away by it. When you observe the thought, I still don't have X. When you see it as a mental event occurring, rather than living it as the direct description of reality, something changes. The pressure that thought exerts on the state diminishes, not because you refuted it, not because you created a more positive thought to replace it, but because the observation created space between thought and identification. And in that space, even if brief, the null state emerges. Now I want to explore a deeper layer. Why does identity resist the null state? Because identity, by definition, is a persistent pattern. And persistent patterns have an inherent tendency towards self-preservation. Not because they're conscious or malicious, but because it's the nature of any system that organizes itself around internal consistency. Your identity will produce thoughts that justify its existence. It will produce discomfort when threatened. It will interpret the approach of the null state, the temporary dissolution, as danger. That's why, at the moment you begin to approach the null state, it's very common for a wave of urgent thoughts to arise. Things you need to resolve right now. Worries that seem to be sleeping and suddenly wake up. A feeling that, I can't stop now, I have too much to do. That's not reality. It's the identity's self-preservation mechanism operating disguised as real urgency. Recognizing this mechanism is the key to not being captured by it. The urgency that arises when you begin to quiet the mind is rarely real urgency. It's identity resistance disguised as real urgency. And recognizing the difference, not intellectually, but in the actual texture of the experience, is a skill that develops with sustained attention. The 0 point of identity, returning to this concept, isn't a place of emptiness where nothing exists. It's a state of uncollapsed potential. When the identity intention is operating, it constantly collapses possibilities into specific configurations. It perceives what's coherent with the dominant pattern and filters the rest. At the 0 point, that collapse is suspended. And what exists in that space is the cognitive equivalent of an open field, where possibilities haven't yet been filtered by any dominant pattern. It's in that field that visualizations planted don't need to overcome the resistance of soil compacted by identity tension. They find real openness. This doesn't guarantee results. Nothing guarantees results. Anything that promises a guarantee is selling illusion. But it dramatically increases the probability that what you introduce into the system will be processed genuinely, and not immediately filtered and neutralized by the dominant pattern. There's a central paradox I want to name explicitly, because it's the heart of everything said so far. To create more efficiently, you need to stop trying to create. not permanently, not as a life philosophy, but as practice, as a prior condition. Creation that emerges from the null state isn't lesser than creation that emerges from intense effort. It's qualitatively different, and it tends to be more effective, not because it's more intense, but because it's more coherent. Because it's born from a system without the background noise of identity tension. And the paradox deepens. The more you understand this mechanism intellectually, the more temptation arises to use it as yet another effort technique. Now I'll enter the null state efficiently, and then I'll visualize precisely, and then I'll create reality optimally. That's the ego trying to capture the mechanism and instrumentalize it within its usual system. It doesn't work. The null state can't be captured. It can only be recognized when it's already present, and then honored, maintained, allowed to be the soil for what comes after. The practical question that naturally arises: how do you develop the capacity to recognize and honor the null state? I'm not going to give a list of techniques, because lists of techniques have a tendency to become more content to be added to the same system that's already overloaded. But I'll point in a direction. The direction is attention to the quality of the state before any practice. Before visualizing, ask, what is the current state? Not judging, not trying to change, just observing. If the state is one of tension, of effort, of urgency, of emotional weight around the desired outcome, that's information. It's not a signal to visualize with more force. It's a signal to stop before continuing. What to do when you stop? Nothing specific. Observe the state instead of being the state. Let the tension exist without feeding it with focused attention. Allow the system to decelerate. This may last 3 minutes. It may last 10. It may take days of consistent practice before the null state appears with enough clarity to be recognizable. But the recognition, when it occurs, is unmistakable. It doesn't have the texture of effort. It doesn't have the weight of wanting. It has the quality of a system that is, finally, in its natural condition. Now I want to go deeper into a dimension that's rarely explored in this kind of discussion: the relationship between language and state. There's a tendency that many people have to continuously narrate their internal experience. I still don't have X. I'm working toward it. I'm practicing. It hasn't arrived yet. Maybe I need more time. Or more effort. That narrative, apparently neutral, apparently merely descriptive, is actively constructive. It doesn't describe the state. It creates and maintains the state. Every time you internally narrate, I still don't have X, you reactivate and reinforce the associated identity pattern. The narrative is the mechanism by which the identity keeps itself active. It's the voice of the pattern continuously confirming itself. The null state isn't narrative. It has no internal voice describing it. There's no "I am in the null state now." It's prior to language. And that's why it's so difficult to capture intellectually, because every effort of capture uses the tool language that's incompatible with the target. What I'm doing here in this text is using language to point towards something that's prior to language. Like pointing a finger at the moon. The finger isn't the moon, but if well directed, it helps you see where to look. The null state isn't in this description. It's in the pause between sentences, when you stop reading for a second and something in you simply is. There's one final layer I want to explore before closing, and it's perhaps the most counterintuitive of all. The null state isn't a state of not wanting. Wanting isn't the problem. Wanting is natural. Wanting is the direction the mind and the human system naturally take. The problem is the quality of the wanting. There's a wanting that's born from identity tension, from "I'm incomplete without X." That wanting is parasitic. It continuously consumes energy and rarely produces lasting satisfaction, because even when X is achieved, the identity that needs X has already migrated to needing Y. And there's a wanting that's born from genuine expression. From X represents something that's coherent with who I deeply am. That wanting has no weight. It has no anxious urgency. It has clarity. The null state doesn't eliminate the second type of wanting. In fact, when identity tension dissolves, genuine wanting becomes clearer, because it's no longer mixed with the noise of deficiency-based wanting. An action that's born from genuine wanting is qualitatively different from action that's born from deficiency-based wanting. It's more precise, it's more sustainable, and it tends to produce results that are coherent with who you actually are, not just with what your identity tension projected as necessary to feel complete. Looking at everything that's been said, what emerges is a simple image, but a radical one. Most people are using the right tool at the wrong moment. Visualization is a genuinely powerful tool. It's not the problem. The problem is the state from which it's being used. And the state isn't corrected by more technique. It's corrected by less, by subtraction, by pause, by permission for the system to rest from the constant effort of being an identity intention toward something. The null state is that rest. And the visualization done after it isn't the same thing as the visualization done before. It's the same technical act executed by a different system, by a mind that stopped confirming its own deficiency and began exploring possibility from a place of real openness. That's the difference. And that difference is everything. The null state emerged from the need to go beyond traditional manifestation techniques. It was created to help you understand and sustain that internal point of neutrality where effort disappears and reality begins to respond coherently. More than learning something new, it's a process of dismantling the identity that forces, allowing change to happen through alignment and not through tension. If what was said here resonated in some way, if you felt something move internally while following this reasoning, there's a deepening material available. It's not mandatory. It's not for everyone. It's for those who feel it makes sense to continue the internal investigation in a more structured way. The link is in the pinned comment. And before closing, Daniel has a simple request. Write in the comments your name and a single word that describes what you felt while following this reasoning. Silence, neutrality, coherence, surrender, space, clarity, any word that's true for you. Not because it's an exercise, but because naming what was felt is, in itself, an act of observation, and observation is the first movement toward the state that was described here. Something wasn't working, and now you see why.